In this installment of how Alberta payroll is being miscalculated and employees underpaid, we're going to discuss the definition of wages. Hello, my name is Christopher Neufeld of Neufeld Legal, and in this particular video, we're going to discuss probably the most important definition in the Employment Standards Code for employees, and one that employers and employees alike fail to address or adhere to all too often. And if you're an employee in the province of Alberta, this is a definition that you really need to understand because it really has fundamental importance to yourself and to collecting upon the earned money that you have legally earned from working for an employer. So let's get to it. Now, the definition of wages is found in Section 1 Sub 1 Paragraph X of the Employment Standards Code of Alberta. So it's at the very beginning, but for some reason, even though it's at the very outset, it seems to have been overlooked all too often by employers and employees alike. And when we read it, it is a very inclusive definition that has very specific exclusions from it. And we'll go through those exclusions because those exclusions are important to understand. Now, what it says at 11X is that wages includes salary, pay, money paid for time off instead of overtime pay, commission, or remuneration for work, however calculated. So from the outset, it takes on a very broad, very inclusive approach to what forms part of wages. And especially with the ending there of this initial phrase, remuneration for work, comma, however calculated. It serves to capture so much. And we're going to get into that. But then it goes on to say, but does not include, and there are 4 items it does not include, and there's a rationale for each one, and we're going to address that right now. Number 1, overtime pay, vacation pay, general holiday pay, and termination pay. So those elements are not included as the first part because they're addressed in other aspects of the Alberta Employment Standards Code. So for purposes of doing calculations, for reporting, and ultimately for making employee pay, you would not want to include these in wages based on the scheme put forward by the legislature because this would effectively result in double counting. So that's something that the legislature did not want. It's not appropriate. So those elements are excluded from the definition of wages. Secondly, a payment made as a gift or bonus that is dependent on the discretion of an employer and that is not related to hours of work, production, or efficiency. Now, we're not really going to address the gift aspect. We're going to focus on the bonus aspect. And the key fundamental aspect here is that for bonuses to be excluded, they must adhere and fit in all these aspects. And that's where the fundamental issue all too often appears, is that whereas some bonuses might well be discretionary to the employer, they also need to not be related to work, production, or efficiency. And unfortunately, that is where most bonuses get captured and most bonuses become part of wages. Third, expenses or an allowance provided instead of expenses. Now, naturally, it's understandable that expenses from a business perspective, from the employer's perspective, are not included because those are properly costs of the employer that the employer is taking on, whether that's airfare, certain tools, certain pieces of equipment and clothing. Those aspects, whether it's directly paid or an allowance is provided for, whether it's a travel allowance, a boot allowance, hazardous goods allowance, all those aspects are properly within the ambit of the employer's money. However, once you get into allowances that are not expenses to the employer, those are inclusive in wages. So what you find is various premiums for working the night shift, to working in hazardous environments, to working in the north. So you'll see northern allowances, you'll see nighttime premiums. Those allowances are properly part of wages and need to be included as such. Next are tips or other gratuities. And yes, they apply mainly to the restaurant field and the hotel industry. But those aspects are also excluded from wages because they are not something that is brought necessarily to the attention of the employer and easily for them to record and report. Now, what is interesting is that we have these 4 exclusions, but one of the primary exclusions that we do not see, which is fundamental in the province of Ontario, which is the basis upon which the Alberta Employment Standards Code was derived, is there is no exclusion in Alberta for employer contributions, which are excluded in Ontario. And why is this important? Because employer contributions are very significant nowadays and represent a form of remuneration that should form part of wages and is not calculated in. And what are we talking about with respect to employer contributions? We're talking about employer contributions to pension plans, RSPs, medical, dental, insurance aspects, CPP, EI. All those aspects are technically contributions from the employer that are being paid on behalf of the employee to their benefit, and as such properly fall in as wages. Now we're going to address this in a separate video to get more into specifics of it as to why they are necessary in Ontario to deal with it as an exclusion and why it is necessary to deal with it as an inclusion in Alberta because of the fundamental differences in other aspects of the Alberta Employment Standards Code that are clearly different from the Ontario Employment Standards Act. But that is something for another video. But what we see here is that we have a lot of aspects that when one looks at it more deeply go missing from the definition of wages and thus the calculation of wages, and which will in turn lead to problems both with reporting and calculations. Because wages is fundamental for purposes of calculating vacation pay, for purposes of calculating general holiday pay, otherwise known as statutory holiday pay, for calculating termination pay in lieu of notice, and also severance pay. But it is also important for purposes of calculating overtime pay, because overtime pay is based on wage rate. And as we'll get into a separate video on wage rate is predicated on the hourly rate of pay for wages. It's not the standard hourly rate, it's not the base hourly rate, it is not the regular hourly rate, which is something that you find in other provinces and most importantly you find in the United States of America. But in Alberta, overtime pay is premised on wage rate, which is the hourly rate of pay for wages. And as such, you can see the fundamental importance of understanding what wages are, calculating wages, and using that identification as a basis for calculating overtime pay, and not deferring to the laws of another province, and even more so not deferring to the laws of another country. Instead, wages are absolutely critical, both from a reporting standpoint and a calculation standpoint. And in turn, the failure to adhere to the definition of wages in the Alberta Employment Standards Code can lead to fundamental problems and underpayments of employee pay to those individuals working in the province of Alberta. Thank you.